Good morning, everybody. My name is Rich Sloma. Welcome to today's New York State Archives presentation of Developing, Renewing, or Reviving a Successful Records Program. Today's presenter is Linda Bull. She is our Catskill Hudson Valley Regional Advisory Officer, one of 5 that we have in New York State that is here to help you with your records management needs. Also, before we begin, just a few administrative items. Just want to ask folks, before you log off, if you could just type in the chat box how many people are there with you at your location watching the webinar. As long as we're on the topic of the chat box, I mentioned earlier there appears to be a glitch with the size of the text in the chat box. It makes it very small. Not really a problem. I can see people typing, and what I'll do is I will copy and paste the information so that we can read out your questions. So if you could have any questions during the presentation, please type them in the chat box in the lower left side of the screen, and I will give those to Linda at the end of the presentation. We'll answer them at that time. Also, there will be a recording available. I'm recording right now, so it'll be available for you after the presentation. And we'll also be sending you a survey. And I also want to note, some folks may not have gotten the instructions. I think in some cases maybe we had a wrong email address, but in others it may be spam filters. So if you could just check your spam filters to make sure anything from the New York State Archives doesn't get blocked. So that should pretty much cover the administrative portions, and at this point I will turn it over to Linda.
Good morning. I hope everyone can hear me. Well, this webinar was developed to help you identify some of the key components for developing, renewing, or reviving a successful records management program. Each program might be a little unique due to the size of the government and its resources, but the task of developing, renewing, or reviving a successful program is not one to be tackled just by the RMO working alone. Today's presentation is the second in a series of 7 webinars to be broadcast every 3rd Wednesday through July. This webinar series is meant to shed light on key records management principles and practices. To register for future webinars, please visit the State Archives website, and these are the topics coming up in the rest of the series. So we want you to sit back and relax for an hour as we discuss the foundations of developing, renewing, or reviving a successful records management program. Please feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation. Simply type them into the chat box, and Rich will read them for us. We apologize and are sorry for any technical difficulties you may have. And as Rich said, we are recording this session for future viewing, and information will be available at a later date in this regard. We hope that you have printed the webinar booklet so that you may take notes throughout the presentation. Now today we're going to address these topics and how they relate to the development of a successful records management program. Authorization refers to a local law or resolution that defines the government's records management program. Now this is not just adopting a retention schedule or assigning an RMO, as we'll talk about in a moment. Budget is funding related to records and information management. Policies and procedures are a written guide or manual to all aspects of your records management program. And I'm underlining the word written. Active records are those used frequently and now are often born digital, electronic records, and email. Inactive records are those records that are used less than once a month, and this can include a storage area for paper records, or even electronic records that need to be retained until their retention periods have been met. Retention and disposition, of course, relates to how long records must be retained according to the State Archives retention schedule or other agency retention schedules that relate to your specific record series. And last but not least, electronic records, which are becoming more and more an integral part of records management in 21st century governments. So many of the local government records management programs started with the adoption of the appropriate State Archives records retention and disposition schedule by the governing board. Records management officers were designated. The local government records law made village clerks and town clerks the records management officers for their governments, and also assigned fire district secretaries to be the records management officer for the fire district. Other local governments needed to designate a records management officer. Now, for many of the local governments, the next step was to begin an involvement in the Local Government Records Management Improvement Fund grants program. An inventory grant was usually first, and then perhaps inactive record storage, followed by microfilming, and so on and so on. Many local government programs were built on this grant funding. Some of the programs stayed focused with the RMO and did not branch out to other departments of the government. Some programs were all-encompassing. Some local governments have had success with continued budget funding. In other governments, RMOs might not have kept up with annual destruction of obsolete records, and so the records management program may have become somewhat stagnant. Earlier we spoke about the key elements of a records management program, and here are some further details expanding on those, and we'll talk about each of these key elements individually as we go forward. And if that wasn't enough, here are some even more items to be considered. And it is important to look at how these items relate, or should relate, to the situation in your particular government, and to develop a priority plan to create what is needed in terms that will work for your local government or your government. Now, when I'm working with the local governments in my region, I often suggest to them to create a local law or resolution that would establish their records management program, as well as indicating its importance to the local government as part of normal business practices. And this also will indicate to the other departments in the government that records management is not just Susie's idea or Tom's job, but is recognized by the board, and that there are shared responsibilities. Your regional advisory officer should be able to provide samples of these from other local governments that you can use to model one for your own local government. But here are some of the main parts of the local government, of the local law or resolution. And you can see that it is far beyond just adopting a retention schedule or assigning an RMO. An annual report by the RMO to the local board can be an effective way of demonstrating that the records management program is ongoing, and reminding them that support is required annually. Showing the accomplishments of the program can be impressive. Sometimes you may want to take your board on tours of perhaps the inactive storage area, or provide some before and after photos when certain activities are going on. But it is important to communicate with them so that they understand, particularly when we are having a lot of turnover in boards. I know some of my local governments are turning over every couple of years, and you know, things that were done in the past they're not aware of, and if we don't bring them to their attention, things will fall by the wayside, particularly financial support. And that leads us to our next one. The State Archives has often stressed the importance of having a separate line item for records management. Now today there are far more elements that are part of a records and information management support system financially. We have electronic content management systems for our imaging and our electronic records. There's software maintenance and upgrade costs. We may still be buying record storage boxes, shredding obsolete paper records, continuing to conserve our historic records. Microfilm that has been done has to be paid for the storage. If we're working with vendors for conversion of backlogs of paper records to electronic images, those costs need to be considered as well. So it's not an inexpensive venture to have a good program, but it needs to be documented, it needs to be supported, it needs to be maintained. Having a records advisory board and conducting regular meetings can be a real asset to your records management program. And this is another way not to have the departments of your local government think that the program is only the RMO's and that there's no responsibility on anyone else's part. The Records Advisory Board can also assist the RMO in creating the designation of the Office of Record, determining which department is creating and maintaining the official copy that is used for retention purposes. And of course, support for the program is something that's needed to continue, and the board can provide such advocacy for that as well. And you see that we're talking about things as well as looking at the appraisal of records, and that's something that can be assisted here as well. I can't say enough about policies and procedures. I think I talk about them in all the workshops that I do. And they're so important, and yet it's something that many folks are sort of loath to get work done. I know it's not an easy task, but it is an important one, because for any program to continue and function smoothly, written policies and procedures are necessary. Many government records programs have gotten by with oral practices, but this makes it difficult to enforce the procedures, and this may be why your records management program has stalled. If policies and procedures are written, authorized by management, and reviewed and updated frequently, it's a lot easier to be able to enforce them. The policies and procedures need to be presented in a training session when they are first introduced, and new employees should be trained in the records management policies and procedures as part of their new employee orientation. Having printed copies of the written policies and procedures in binders, as well as perhaps having them posted on the network, can make it easy for personnel to refer to them when they have questions without having to bother the RMO. Periodic training, perhaps on Records Management Day, to review the records management policies and procedures is something you may want to do as well. Now, the State Archives has a webinar and has workshops regarding the development of records management policies and procedures, and I encourage you to look into those and attend as you are able. As mentioned previously, active records are those records that are used frequently. Now, these can be paper records or electronic records, and both require standardization in their organization or filing in order to provide easy access. Adopting a file plan for both electronic and paper records, establishing naming conventions, and what should be included in each file. Filing electronically does not reduce the need for a file plan. If anything, it makes the need for controlled vocabulary even more necessary. We want to use the appropriate filing method, whether it's alphabetically, numerically, alphanumeric, in order to provide access entirely by a database. We should also be anticipating retention and not trying to file records with all kinds of different retention periods together, making it difficult to purge records as records become meeting their retention periods. And this is true whether it's paper or electronic records. Sometimes this seems almost unavoidable, but if we can still identify the record series within the same folders by retention periods, it will make things easier. Now here's somewhat of an example of a master file plan showing a 3-level structure where we have a main code, a subheading, and then the series title. And again, there are resources from the State Archives to help you with designing some of this, and there is one of these webinars that's going to be on files management for electronic records that's coming up. Destruction of obsolete records. Some of the local governments I work with have an annual records management day or even 2 days. And this is a time when the offices are closed to the public and records management activities are the focus for the day. Everyone works together that day. They dress probably casually. They might be sharing a pizza lunch or something later on, but all the obsolete records are documented and destroyed that day. Another year's worth of official copies of records that have become inactive are boxed, labeled, and moved into inactive storage. No obsolete records are kept beyond the retention period just because. But if there is necessity for a legal hold because there's pending litigation, a notice of claim has been received, or a notice about a pending audit, then the records related to those actions, of course, would be held until after the litigation or audit has been completed. Now, as we're getting more into electronic records, Records Management Day can also be used to organize electronic records and as well as email. We've talked in some of our retention schedule workshops about creating office retention schedules. And this is an excellent way to assure that the official copies of records are retained appropriately, and also to prevent the needless duplicate copies of records from being boxed up and stored in inactive storage. Each office of your government will have its own schedule showing all of the records that that particular office uses. If that office is responsible for an official copy of a record, that would be indicated along with the appropriate retention schedule citation. The office retention schedule can also be used to indicate the format of the official copy and whether it's paper, microfilm, or electronic. Usually, the office retention schedule will show the full retention time, the active record time, and then whether the record is retained longer and sent to inactive storage until it's met its retention period. The office retention schedule also indicates retention for those records that are not the official copy and can be destroyed based on item 19 as a duplicate copy and destroyed when no longer needed. By having all of the departments using office retention schedules when we're working with paper records, this makes the transition to managing electronic records and images with an electronic content management system easier, and also helps to avoid duplication of electronic records. Now, I apologize for how crowded this slide is, but at the same time, you can see that we have the record series, the citation from the archives retention schedule, the minimum retention period, the length of time the record is going to stay in the office area, and then the number of years it would be retained in storage. And since we're talking about assessment records here, the final assessment roles, we have the MU1 citation, the retention period of 10 years, keeping 1 year in the office and 9 years in storage as an example. Then if we go down here to a record series that is not the official copy in this particular office, this one being purchase orders, and it is duly noted that they're duplicate records, and it shows my favorite item number 19 as the official citation, 0 after no longer needed, and this particular assessor's office has decided they're not going to retain a copy at all because they know if they need to refer to them, they can go to the bookkeeper or the comptroller's office and be able to get the information that they need. So I hope that this at least is giving you an idea of how it will work. And it's also called a subject matter list because that's something that you need for the Freedom of Information Law or FOIL. And by having it spelled out exactly what records are being maintained by what office, it certainly can facilitate that as well. Now, as mentioned previously, inactive records are those official records that are not referred to more often than once a month. And having some kind of centralized storage is more efficient and saves money because by freeing up space in filing cabinets and boxing inactive records in cubic foot storage boxes to go on 18-gauge steel shelving, you can avoid the purchase of additional cabinets, and by having smaller, more organized files means a decrease in staff time required to search through records. And this can improve efficiency through an orderly arrangement and control, providing fast and easy box and folder retrieval. And we've provided some physical security by having them together and in one place under the control of our RMO, accessible to a limited number of people, and in an area with limited points of access. So this should be an area that's safe for both our records and our people. This can also help to protect confidential records from unauthorized access, again because they're under stricter, tighter controls, and provides for the systematic legal disposition of records. If the records are in a record center, it's easier for all of those that are eligible to be destroyed at the same time for that to be managed. And it's also much easier to handle a legal hold if we have litigation pending. Historical Records Program. Now, historical or archival records can help us to document policies, decisions, ways of conducting business, and tell us how things were done in the past. Historical records can be used to create exhibits or assist in the development of curriculum for the local schools to bring a sense of community to an area. And I'm seeing more and more governments including some of their history on their website or utilize it on maybe a social media page like Facebook. Historical records are permanent records, and efforts need to be made to assure that they are properly preserved. So now we're going to talk about preserving. There are several methods of preserving historical records. Conservation means making improvements with the physical records. And if the paper, for example, is acidic, this can mean having a professional paper conservator deacidify the paper, and perhaps even where necessary, historic books be rebound. Reformatting is another alternative. That involves the creation of another copy of the information contained in the historical records. If we have a small volume of historical records, making a paper copy is an inexpensive way to provide access to the historical information and to avoid additional handling of the original record. Microfilm has long been a way to create or use a use or access copy, of fragile historic material. The past several years has introduced digital copies of historical records. Digital copies can make it easy to create an exhibit of historic material by printing the digital information, and again avoiding additional wear and tear on the originals. Digital versions of historical records can be shared on the government's website or used in a school curriculum for the study of local history. Of course, a migration plan is necessary for the digital official copy of historical records to assure that they will be usable and available for the full retention requirement. And we'll talk more about that a little later. Now, we've already mentioned some of the aspects of electronic records management because they're very similar to the management of paper records. But there are also special considerations, and we'll talk about those in our next few slides. A technology steering committee is something that you might want to consider to provide the appropriate administrative support for formulating and implementing a legally compliant electronic records program. Now, the committee could be an offshoot of your records advisory board, or it may be a separate group focusing only on technology issues. And we're suggesting some members for this particular group or committee. The RMO, because that person understands above anyone else the retention and other records issues that need to be part of the technology. IT staff, or whatever computer support is available to you, because we know that many of the local governments contract for technological support. With electronic records, it's increasingly an IT person takes the lead in identifying and managing major tasks, but the RMO and IT must work together to assure that such issues as records retention are considered as well. Legal counsel as part of the team, because they must understand your computing environment to be able to respond appropriately to electronic discovery actions, and can advise on laws and regulations and policies. An administrator or chief executive officer, someone who understands the budgetary implications of maintaining electronic records over time. And for the same reason, you may also want to consider having a board member to help assure the long-term support of technology. Technology has become so easy with Google and all of that and the internet that sometimes our administrative folks and our boards don't really understand what goes into creating images, maintaining electronic records, and so on. Users of the records are also important, of course, and they have the best knowledge of how a system works for their particular applications. Now, you don't have to have all your users on this committee, but you may want to involve someone who can represent your user groups. This might be someone from the largest user group in your government, or it may be just a user who understands and can be an advocate to the RMO and to the committee. Document imaging. Having a plan for document imaging through your government is important. Without a plan, often employees will do whatever seems to make sense to them without any regard for the appropriate format for the images, what types of records should or should not be scanned, and so on. And this can create what I am calling electronic records chaos. And if an electronic content management system is part of your imaging plan, then having an organizational structure or file plan, of course, is a must. Because if we're going to create images of records, and we're doing so to facilitate the retrieval of the information and make it easier than going to an inactive storage room perhaps and climbing on a ladder and all of that sort of thing, we need to make sure that we can find the images, that they're organized, and that they will do what we need for them to do. And of course, we're talking about, again, written policies and procedures. Now, there have been previous webinars about document imaging, and the State Archives imaging guidelines are posted to the website. And I suggest that if you haven't familiarized yourselves with them as yet, you will want to do that. Records retention and disposition for electronic records is important. There needs to be a plan for incorporating retention requirements for electronic records. Electronic records should be destroyed when their retention requirements have been met, or if that has not yet occurred, we need to have a migration plan in place to assure that official electronic records requiring long-term or permanent retention will be appropriately maintained. Because of the technological advances and potential obsolescence of technology currently in place, it's so important for organizations to plan future migrations to new media and new systems. Storage media often becomes obsolete and are replaced with new technology before the end of their life expectancy. And not only that, but devices used to read the storage media is also being replaced with higher performing or higher capacity devices, and finding older hardware that can read older media may be difficult or impossible, and certainly costly. If a record system stores records with retention periods exceeding the lifespan of the hardware and software in use, it's essential to plan for future data migration. To ensure the contents of the media are readily accessible, migration to a newer media platform every 5 years is something that's recommended in the State Archives imaging guidelines. The reality of technical obsolescence requires that local governments and state agencies monitor technology trends and industry developments to ensure their records are accessible over the required retention periods of the systems on which they are stored. It is also important to have a written backup policy spelling out how often electronic records are backed up, where the backups are stored, and a rotation schedule since the backups need to follow the retention schedule. It's also important to check that the backups are tested to assure that all files have been backed up and are readable. The backups should be stored in areas geographically remote from the offices where the servers are located. The necessary distance of backup storage from offices will vary based on the geographical, meteorological, and human risks of the offices. An appropriate backup location will be one where it is highly unlikely that the backup location will simultaneously suffer the same disaster as the offices. And we can't stress enough how important it is to test the backups. I know one of my local governments told me about a situation that they had where they were backing up with their local IT service provider. And then one day, there was a crash that involved the records for the receiver of taxes. And all of a sudden, they found out that the backups had not been working appropriately, and they had no way to restore the last 2 years of information. The slide talks about backing up to the cloud, and that certainly is an option that some folks are doing. Some folks are doing it even as a secondary backup. They're doing a backup locally, storing the backup off-site, doing the rotation on a regular schedule, and then also backing up to the cloud, using one of the cloud service providers for this type of service, so that there's that added level of security. The retention schedule talks about system backup files and copies of master files or databases, application software logs, directories, and other records needed to restore a system in case of a disaster or inadvertent destruction, and the retention being 0 after 3 system backup cycles. Email as records. Identifying a solution for managing email, you've got to consider how your local government or your government is using email. So one way might be to survey your users um, asking how they're using it, what they're using it for, and so on, because that can help you to identify a retention period that would be necessary, or retention periods to cover how email is used as records in your organization. There are various solutions ranging from a low-tech solution that may be appropriate for a small government with little in-house IT support to highly automated systems working for large organizations, state agencies, and some of this does, of course, pertain to the individual culture. Do individual work habits lend themselves to change? Is there a need to share information on emails across the organization? And of course, we have limitations on the levels of support that we may be able to have. We need, from management, we need to have policy development and enforcement. From IT, the ideas of solutions that will work within our government. And we need to have staff who are trained and recognize the need to manage email and the risks involved in not managing email. The limitations of training personnel and technology must be balanced with the automatic versus manual functions, and look at what can work for your local government. And again, there are workshops, there are publications on the State Archives website that can help you with identifying email as records and creating policy, email management policy. Disaster planning for records is something that you all should be looking at if you haven't already. And some of the benefits can include safety, because improved safety for records usually means improvements for people as well, and can ensure a safe response to a disaster. Staff are trained how to identify disaster, and staff are trained in how to respond to disasters safely and appropriately. Evaluation of security allows improvement of security. Though focused on records, these can also be general improvements for the government as well. An efficient response to disasters by planning, training, practicing. This can lead to a good response so that when there is a disaster, there's not a lot of time wasted kind of spinning wheels trying to decide what to do. Vital records protection. Disaster planning focuses on protecting vital records. Now, those vital records are those that are needed for day-to-day operations. And often, not until the records are not available do people really understand the importance of the records. This isn't the birth, death, and marriage records, the vital statistic records that our towns and villages maintain. These are the records that are vital to the operation of our governments. We want to have an easy resumption of normal operations after a disaster has occurred. This is very important. And to reduce that amount of downtime, returning quickly to providing our services to our citizens and others within our local government. The State Archives has workshops and publications and all kinds of resources related to disaster planning for records management and what to do after there's been a disaster. And these are posted on, again, on our website. A business continuity plan sort of goes hand in hand with disaster planning. disaster recovery. And this is sort of the final step to get back into business, using your records, doing your work. Sometimes we have to have repairs or replacements to our facilities. Sometimes we're using temporary quarters elsewhere because there's been a disaster. We need to think about things like cleaning or replacing equipment, using insurance money to replace, but occasionally sometimes things can be cleaned and reused as well. We need to reload our backup data so our computers can be back in business, at least to some point in the recent past, because that's actually what backup is for. It's for recovery after a disaster. We want to reorganize and store records, paper records, reorganizing them back on shelves, and then getting back to work. And then evaluating our disaster response. How did things go? What would we change for another time so that we've improved our disaster plan and our business recovery plan as a result. So if you're starting from the beginning, please don't think that this is something that can be done overnight. Again, it's important to prioritize and then take things in a logical sequence. If you're trying to renew, then it's important to select those areas that you believe are the most important to your renewal process and start with them. And if you're trying to revive a program that you began, it's important to really look at where you are and determine where you would like to be and create a prioritized plan for getting there. Again, stressing the idea of written policies and procedures. Now here are a few of the resources available from State Archives publications that I think might be helpful. And of course the main web address for the Archives website is always a good place to start. And here's some further resources, and again, the important imaging guidelines if you're not familiar yet with those, and one on email and managing records disasters, using a data storage vendor that kind of gets into the cloud and some of that. And please don't forget our webinars and our workshops. And in conclusion, records are important to our government. Records management applies to all records. Supporting the records program is your responsibility. A good records management program demonstrates to the public that records are properly maintained. Records are important to your local government. And finally, thank you. If anyone has any questions, Rich is happy to work with you now on those. And again, there will be a survey coming out to talk about, ask you about today's webinar. Thanks so much for coming.
Yes, hi Linda.
Rich,
no, I don't
see
anybody typing any questions. As I mentioned earlier, the print's really small, but I can copy it and I can see it. Also, if you haven't already, if you could just let us know how many people were in the room with you watching the webinar. I have comments from some of you on that. And I think you pretty much covered the recording and the survey. And that's all we have. If there aren't any questions, then I see something here. There's a question. I think it's from Mary. Let me go ahead and pull this up. Yes, Mary asks a question: can school board policies and flowcharts suffice for a policies and procedures manual?
I would say that it would depend on the content of what the policies are and how often these are brought forward in training and that sort of thing. The one thing that is not good about policies and procedures is publishing them, having them in a really nice binder, making sure everybody has a copy of a binder, but nobody knows what they're all about. So it's important to have them as part of a training process and perhaps an annual renewal of that, or at least a re-education. I would say, Mary, the same thing if they're on the website. It's just making sure people understand that they're there and what they're all about, because it can be very daunting. And I know one of my local governments actually has some of the basic ones related to the records management program on a set of CDs, and so they're like little mini webinars in and of themselves, so that if you want a refresher on inactive records, you could take the CD on inactive records and listen and see the slides and review the policies and procedures related to that activity, or on imaging, or any of the other specifics. But it's really important that they don't get lost in the morass of general bureaucracy within the organization, and people do really understand that they're there and that they have some responsibilities for them. Okay, I saw quite a lengthy question here about resources for advocacy for a strong records management program. Yes, there's some resources. There's some of our publications. There's definitely some a workshop that gets into this, and advocacy is important, and it is important, as you suggest, for a nonprofit, as well as it would be for government. But it's kind of identifying where to get that advocacy from, and having teams, having involvement, having more than just one person being the standard bearer is certainly something that you want to work on and see how you can get that going. Publicity is always good. If there's a way to demonstrate some of the activities that you're doing, whether it's before and afters, whether it's some kind of a project or a program that you can put on. Sometimes these are ways to help get advocacy for programs.
Okay. Let's see if there's any other questions from anyone. I don't see anybody typing. Well, it looks like there may not be any other questions.
Well, thank you everyone for coming today. And thank Rich for your assistance as well.
Oh, glad to help, Linda. This is really great to interact with folks. And if anybody has any questions, later on, please feel free to email us, and I'll either send it to Linda or perhaps the regional advisory officer in your area. Okay, thanks everybody.